Hey everyone, my name is Javier Vargas, and this is my presentation on Christian fundamentalism. But before we start talking about Christian fundamentalism, I think it's more important that we actually start off with Darwinism. Darwinism was created by Charles Darwin in the year 1859. Darwinism was basically the theory that organisms evolve over time, and as a result of this change over time, organisms received physical or behavioral traits which better help these organisms adapt to the surrounding environment and actually help them live longer. So this was important because Darwinism basically led to Charles Darwin discovering that humans and apes share common ancestors. And Darwin specifically noted that the great apes of Africa and humans share the most common DNA. This was important because humans first evolved in Africa. So basically, Darwin noted that humans could have evolved from apes. So this obviously upset a lot of people, specifically the Christian conservatives, who believed the Bible was correct word for word. This actually did not upset a lot of the Democratic Christians because they took into account more of the lessons learned in the Bible than the historical aspects, and they believed Darwin had enough evidence to prove that Darwinism was correct. So, because of Darwinism, theological modernism was created. And if you're wondering what theological modernism is, theological modernism began in the late 19th century and continued on to the early 20th century. It was created to make harmony between Christianity, modern science, and philosophy. There were a lot of critics, though, specifically the priest of the Roman Church, St. Pius X, who called modernism the denial of faith. He claimed that philosophy denied knowledge. Theological modernism aimed to revise traditional Christian beliefs in development in science and the theory of evolution. So, theological modernists still believed in God, and they still believed in most parts of the Bible, specifically the lessons learned, but they noted to take away most of the historical aspects because they proved to be wrong. Evolution had enough evidence to back up, and the earth was actually older than it was stated in the Bible. So, theological modernism obviously made some people upset, and it actually led to the creation of Christian fundamentalism, which we will get to next. So, it is important to know most Christian fundamentalists are not like your average Christian. Christian fundamentalists are far more extreme, but we'll get into that later. So, it's important to know that fundamentalists have a very literal interpretation of the Bible. They believe every single word in the Bible. They do not question a single thing about the Bible. So, the fundamentalists basically practice not drinking, not smoking, not watching movies or plays, or even dancing. So, there's a ton of theories out whether or not what influences Christian fundamentalism or what doesn't. So obviously Christianity is going to be one of them, but there's two others. Evangelicalism, which is basically a relationship with God and your faith in Him. Basically, it's the belief of reincarnation and your lifelong relationship with God and trying to be a good person. So dispensationalism was biblical history being divided into 7 dispensations, in which God has placed certain rules humans have to follow so they can be salvaged and go to heaven instead of Armageddon, which is hell, in other words. Next, we're going to talk about leadership and Christian fundamentalism. So let's actually start off with William Bell Riley, who came up with the concept of Christian fundamentalism. William Bell Riley was a Minneapolis priest who was anti-evolution and considered the granddaddy of fundamentalism. It is also important to note that most of his writing was considered anti-Semitic, and we're going to come back to that later. Dwight L. Moody and John Nelson Darby were heavily influenced by William Bell Riley, specifically Dwight L. Moody, who was considered William Bell Riley 2.0. So Dwight L. Moody and John Nelson Darby basically helped develop fundamentalism further after William Bell Riley's passing. Next, we're going to talk about Lyman and Milton Stewart, the two most important people on this list. They were both brothers and they were both preachers, and they both anonymously funded 5 books called The Fundamentals in 1909. But it's really important, and we're going to talk about later, that they did this anonymously. So, fundamentalists had a lot of grievances against the rest of society. Basically, they debated how old the earth was, because in the Bible it's only a few thousand years old, while science has shown us that that is false and that the earth is actually millions or even billions of years old. Fundamentalists also were very traditional, so they were against abortion because it was kind of referenced that God isn't a fan of abortion, and fundamentalists hate basically homosexuals, transgender, equality, and democracy. They believe that democracy was created by the devil. Next, they also believe that evolution didn't actually happen and that God just made us like Adam and Eve, as in referenced in the Bible. And fundamentalists believe that they can actually prove the existence of absolute truth, even though it was more of a concept than an actual thing you could physically touch or show someone. So there were actually a lot of criticisms against fundamentalists, but we'll get through the easiest ones first. So fundamentalists made it seem like there were only two choices. You could either be a fundamentalist or you could go to hell, literally when Jesus would return. Secondly, fundamentalists actually believed that they were put on this earth to save the world. I'm not kidding. Third, fundamentalists actually didn't believe in science because they believed it just disproved the Bible, which proved that it was evil. Also, fundamentalists were kind of dumb, which was surprising because most of the fundamentalists at the beginning were really rich and they were actually pretty smart by society standards. As Christian fundamentalism grew, so did the variety of members. While they were all still white, Christian fundamentalism began with rich, educated white men, and the newer members were a little bit dumber and didn't have as much money as the original members. So next, let's talk about the major events that affected Christian fundamentalism. First, let's start off with the fundamentals. 5 books that were written that basically disputed science and philosophy. We'll talk about those books later. Secondly, let's talk about the term fundamentalism. It's basically officially recognized throughout the country, and most of the people in the US finally know who they are and what they stand for. Next, let's talk about the Scopes monkey trial. It was basically a trial between John Thomas Scopes versus the state of Tennessee. John Thomas Scopes was a teacher who was basically teaching evolution, even though it was banned in the state of Tennessee. John eventually wins, and he has to pay a small $100 ticket fine, and society begins to look down on fundamentalism and assume that most of the members are dumb. Next, let's go to the internal issues. Internal issues began because of the John Thomas Scopes versus State of Tennessee trial, and now most of the members of the fundamentalism movement began to question where fundamentalism is heading, and basically fundamentalism becomes less popular. Next, let's talk about the supportive environment. Christian fundamentalism began in America. It has spread to Canada and Australia, but it's remained the most popular in America. Next, let's talk about the members. As we've touched upon, most of the members were rich white people, specifically the baby boomers. This mainly pertains to the original members, though. As the group began to get bigger, so did the variety of members, specifically how much they made and how educated they were, because most of the new members were a little bit dumber and they didn't have as much money. It is important to note that fundamentalism has grown to other religions, though, like the Sikh, Islamic, Hindu, and Jewish communities, which was ironic because William Bell Riley's writing was anti-Semitic. There are 58 fundamentalist churches around the world. There's only 4 in the US. 2 of the churches, the locations are unknown, but one's in California and one's in Wisconsin. Yes, Christian fundamentalism was supported by priests and preachers, but it wasn't done publicly. Most of this was done anonymously, as noted in the Lyman and Milton Stewart section. So the current supporters of Christian fundamentalism are still white people, but we don't know their wages as much because most fundamentalists aren't publicly fundamentalist. So I've been teasing you guys about this the whole time, so now let's finally talk about it. The 5 books of fundamentals. There's one main subject per book. The 5 subjects go as number 1, biblical inerrancy. Basically, the Bible has no faults. Second, the divinity of Jesus. Third, the virgin birth, the birth of Jesus Christ, and Virgin Mary having a child even though she was a virgin. Fourth, the belief that Jesus died to redeem humankind. Fifth, the expectation and second coming of Jesus Christ. Most Christian fundamentalists actually owned all 5 of these books. So I grew up in a half Christian, half Catholic household. My mom's side of the family was Christian, my dad's side was Catholic. So I've always believed in God. But I also believe in evolution. I've always thought that there was enough evidence to back it up. And I've always thought that the earth was actually older than stated in the Bible. But I think it's important to note, I don't read the Bible for the historical aspects. I read the Bible for the lessons learned and how to become a better person. But that's just my personal take and how I have my relationship with God. So what I'm going to say next is going to be controversial. But I just want everybody to listen. So my biggest issue with Christianity in the U.S. is that they whitewash God. And I'm not saying that just because God would be a minority that makes minorities better than everyone, because that's not true. And I don't believe that at all. I just think that there would be less hate crimes committed if more people knew that God was a black man, and as you'll read in the next passage, that there's proof that God wasn't white. So if fundamentalists believe every single part of the Bible, and they believe there's nothing wrong with it, then they would have no issue believing that God was a black man. So why do they go out of their way to hate and commit crimes against the minorities? My point being is, groups like the KKK, the Nazis, and other hate groups in general just use religion as a scapegoat and as a sign of white supremacy. If Christianity in the U.S. really represented God correctly, I believe there would be a lot less hate crimes, but there would also be a lot less Christians, Catholics, and fundamentalists in the U.S. I think politics being interwoven with religion is a mistake, and I say this as a Christian who prays and reads the Bible every day. I just think that there's no place for it, and I do think that conservatives have a very off view of God, in my opinion. I see God as a man who loves everyone. He's fed the homeless. He helped people migrate to a different country. I think that, honestly, as someone who votes moderate, I think that liberals have a better view on God. I think he's more kind. He's a nice person. And I think he's better represented by liberals than he is by conservatives and their hard views on him. As we've read and talked about, fundamentalists believe every single word of the Bible. But do you guys believe that there would be as many fundamentalist Christians, Catholics, if they really knew that God was a minority? I personally don't. And I think that this passage just proves that they choose to select and ignore certain parts of the Bible just so it can fit their narrative and so they can use it to hate on other people and other groups. And this is wrong. Using religion as a scapegoat for hate is wrong. Religion is supposed to bring people together instead of tearing them apart, in my personal opinion. So, Christian fundamentalists had some impact on the government. First, let's start off with prohibition. Prohibition, for those of you who don't know, was the banning of alcohol in the U.S. So, fundamentalists were obviously for this because they don't drink, and they thought it was a sin to drink. Next, let's talk about their ban on evolution teaching at school. So obviously this was very controversial and it created a ton of issues, and obviously this led to the monkey Scopes trial, which next we'll talk about. So the Scopes monkey trial had a lot of effect in the country, specifically the North versus the South, because the North sided with John Scopes, while the South was very upset and they didn't want evolution being taught because they thought it would corrupt the youth. So I've been hinting at this whole presentation, but I'll just be blunt during the summary. I think most Christian fundamentalists would be in a hate group. I'm not saying all of the members would be, but I think the majority of them would be, because they were bigots who were anti-Semitic, they were against homosexuality, they were against minorities, they were against women. I think that this group represented a lot of hate, and they used religion as a scapegoat. Christian fundamentalists are the most violent group of protesters, and they're the most heavily watched by the police. I just think it's really important that we emphasize this point. Not all Christians are Christian fundamentalists, and it's important to differentiate the two, because Christian fundamentalists are more like a cult than they are followers of God, in my personal opinion. Here's my works cited, and thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope all of you have a good day, and thank you for listening.